Somos Viña.
We are Vineyard.
We have a message that is tailor-made for people who are older, who are still in the grip of a bad pregnancy or a terrible brutalization. And then the third thing, the first was detachment or disattachment. I'd rather say detachment sounds too Eastern. Disattachment.
Yeah, right.
Second is you bring your story to Christ on the cross, and he says, neither do I condemn thee. And we don't, by the way. I know that I'm saying to people that you won't, oh, of course I do. No, you don't. You say you do, but you haven't told your wife something. You never told your mother. You absolutely never told a friend about such and such. It's imperative, empirically for you to have a happy third. And the last thing, and this is the good news, in the last third of life, you can't ask a pastor. People constantly say to me, or they'll ask you, oh, well, now, are you writing? Or, what are you doing? And when you're in the last third of life, you can't answer the question. It's the wrong, that's the law, because you're not in the second third.
Yeah.
What happens is you stop, you wait, and God brings things for you to do. And this happens all the time. I mean, if I just don't initiate, I get 3 or 4 phone calls a day that involve a ministry response. It's not like I'm trying to write a book or I'm trying to have this effect on somebody, but something comes to you. I mean, it happens today. Just literally today, it's happened about 4 times. If you stop, there's a song, a Philadelphia soul song. What is it? Stop, look, listen to your heart. It's about 1974, and what happens is something comes to you and you get called to do this or that. And that's how God works.
Welcome to the We Are Vineyard podcast, conversations to help us grow with Jesus and each other. In today's episode, our host Jay Pathak talks with Paul Zahl. Paul is an author and retired Episcopal minister. If you were with us at the 2023 National Conference, you'll remember Jay and Danielle referencing one of his books, and we're excited to learn more from Paul's work today. Let's listen in.
I'm really glad you're joining us for our podcast. You've not had a chance to listen to it, but it's mostly just storying. So let's start where we should start, which is where you were born and where you grew up. Let's start there.
I'm a little reluctant to talk about my early background because I don't usually talk about it because the world would call it privileged, and I don't like to really talk about it. And as a matter of fact, I think I've spent most of my ministry never mentioning it in the terms, because I just didn't want to get into it. But I grew up in New York City, let's just say it that way. Was a little boy there and was educated there. And then we moved to Washington, D.C., where my father had a very interesting job. I went to an Episcopal prep school in D.C. for my entire childhood and adolescence, and then went on a Moorhead scholarship to Chapel Hill for 2 years and transferred to Harvard College, where I got my degree in classics and philosophy, and then went to Harvard Law School for a brief period of time and had a kind of conversion, a real conversion out of that. Then married my wonderful wife, Mary, with whom I've been married for almost 50 years, just under 50. And we have 3 sons, David and John and Simeon, and 7 grandchildren. But after the conversion, I went to an evangelical seminary, charismatic evangelical seminary of the Church of England, which was a complete tautology. We used to say that Clemson University was a tautology. That's not fair, but we did, and we found our way to a place where your great patron saint David Watson was totally in the mix, and we got to know him not well, but enough. Yeah. Then I was trained in the C of E, but in an evangelical charismatic minority, but almost majority in the C of E. Came back to an entirely different world after the training in England and the degree. I was Jimmy Dunn's first graduate student. Wow. And then we came back and I was ordained in the Episcopal Diocese of Washington at the National Cathedral and served unhappily but loyally there. I'm still in that diocese. I'm still a priest in good standing in that diocese, but served there and then served parishes in New York City for a long time, Westchester County, outside New York for a long time, briefly in Charleston, South Carolina. Then with my entire family, we went to Tuebingen, Germany, where I became Jürgen Moltmann's last international student before he retired, and completed a PhD in Tübingen in the German language. And that was difficult, but we did it. And then was called to be the dean and rector of the Episcopal Cathedral in Birmingham, Alabama, for 10 wonderful years, following which the political conflict within the Episcopal Church became overwhelmingly challenging, defeating. It was defeating, but I became the dean of the, quote, evangelical / charismatic Episcopal Seminary in Pittsburgh. And there was tremendous conflict on all sides.
Yeah.
And it really discouraged me to such an extent that I took early retirement, but then was called to be the rector of All Saints Episcopal Church in Chevy Chase, which is just outside the District of Columbia line, and served there with Mary for about 3 years. And they were good years, but again, the conflict in the church was defeating to the extent that it certainly defeated me. And I couldn't sustain what I needed to really keep my head up in this enormous conflict, which was consuming so many. So I took a kind of early retirement. I shouldn't have. I couldn't go on as I was, although we had a wonderful time there. And I think we're still, we love the people there, and I think it's mutual. And then I've spent about 10 years in the wilderness, in my 60s, living in different places with Mary and watching our wonderful children go forward, because the message never flagged. The message of God's grace to sinners never flagged, but the confidence in how to do it in concrete terms, which I'm sure some of our viewers can understand, had taken its toll. But I came back gradually, and now I'm still retired, but I'm very involved in mentoring a lot of young clergy in the Episcopal Church, a lot, and students, and I'm part of a wonderful church in Birmingham as a member of the congregation. So I'm continuing to write, dwelling on what it's like to have 50 years of ordained service in a church, and trying to reflect on what that means. So that's with my remarkable landscape gardener wife, Mary. I hope that answers the question.
No, that does. That's great. So let's back up a bit, because I'm always interested, all the rage is the Marvel movies, right? Which is the origin story. Like, how does this person become who they become? So I'm always interested with people that I admire at a distance to kind of hear how, formative experiences, like how were they shaped to be the kind of person that does this kind of work? So I'm curious for you. You described sort of a conversion experience, I think you said at Harvard. But prior to that, is church familiar? Are you raised in church? Are you doing church kinds of things? Is like life and teaching of Jesus present? Is that kind of how you grow up?
Yes and no. My mother, I grew up in the Episcopal Church, in that it was a church. And I went to the Episcopal Chapel for 8 years, every single day of my entire life. But my mother was a Christian Scientist. That had been early in her marriage, or my parents' marriage. And so I was taken to the Christian Science Church in New York as a youngster, and that continued. And that was an influence, but I was also completely within a very benign Episcopal setup. The trouble with it was that it was benign and there was nothing to react against. I didn't react against it because it was very horizontal. It was liturgically very good, and musically and aesthetically, but there was very little to react to. There was very little law.
Right.
And that was the 60s, but even so, there was very little law except, have you done enough to help your fellow man?
Yeah.
So the Christian Science element was there, but it wasn't, I was deeply interested in theology, but I was converted, like I had a relationship in college, broke up very sort of threw me when I was at Harvard College. Actually, when I was, quote, in the law school, quote, and I was invited to a focus camp. It's a prep school ministry in the Northeast, a very good ministry, and I was converted like that.
Really?
So I was deeply looking for a personal relationship. And then, Jay, the being in England, I mean, I was in the world of Michael Green, John Stott, J.I. Packer, but it was softened. It was leavened by the charismatic movement, which had softened the doctrinal sort of reformed orthodoxy in experience. And people were deeply involved in healing. And Mary and I ran into a man named Frank Lake, who became a celebrated Christian, charismatic psychoanalyst, a very unusual collection of gifts. And he had an enormous impact, together with a woman named Anne Long, who later on is a wonderful pastoral counselor, now 90 in the C of E. So our evangelicalism was softened by the charismatic, by the John Wimber element. I mean, we were, David Watson was very much in the air tonight, to quote Phil Collins and Miami Vice. And then I had a challenge in my ministry, a kind of depressive episode in the late 70s, right in the middle of raising children and being very involved. And I went to see Frank again, and he was remarkably deep going, and that had a great influence. And we also worked with a man named Fitzsimmons Allison, who later became the Episcopal Bishop of South Carolina. And he had discovered the gospel, you might say it, through the writings of the English Reformation in a way that we'd never heard. It was not the law, it was really the gospel. He really had discovered the Lutheran insight, but through the Anglican reformers. And he meant it. And we were with him for 6 years. And that we found ourselves working in a very different way with people and the congregation. But it grew rapidly because many wounded people had never heard this message before. And we had a wonderful experience. So I've talked about early childhood, I've talked about a conversion, and I've talked about the softening and the depth of the charismatic element, which brought us a tremendous range of interesting people and healing people. And there have been others, but I would count Frank Lake and Fitz Allison. There are a few others I could mention as formative, because what happens with clergy, almost all clergy at some point go through, if not a crisis of faith, a crisis of stress. It's usually based upon what psychiatrists call transference. In other words, people transfer to you images of their father. Women do it in a somewhat different way. Men do it. People do it. And this can create enormous confusion on the part of the pastor. And what is really going on here? And I was alerted to that in a way that was very helpful. But a lot of pastors sort of get undone by it. They get confused by the signals they're getting, which have nothing to do with them.
Right.
Adoration, but it's really not. It's adoration coupled with rejection, two sides of the same coin. So Frank helped us see a lot of that and understand it while still being normal and human. And so we learned a great deal, but the primary stress of a clergyman, it is in fact more with men than with women for a sort of a number of different reasons that I envy the ability of women to at times evade a certain kind of transference that comes to their male clergy that can cause enormous misunderstanding. But we became sensitive to that. I did, and had great support and continued to be in the ministry, and as we still sort of are.
Well, and let's talk about that, because you said a number of things there that I find really interesting. I mean, about kind of having a conversion experience because you were looking for it. That's That's a real thought because, if you operate under the assumption that people really don't want this, so we got to really talk them into it, you're kind of starting on the wrong foot a lot when you're doing ministry, as opposed to, man, what we've got is good news. It's the kind of thing if people could understand or they could come out of their own shame, they would come to life. And there are people digging around for this. So it's less about trying to talk people into things. It's more about revealing the great treasure that is often right underfoot. But so I like that image. And so tell me more about how did that, so you just hear a preacher and you go, yes, I'm in? I mean, is it that straightforward?
In my case, it was, but nothing is. It's all internal. You
sure.
What I compare it to the Death Star in Star Wars, because you remember the Death Star has a little tiny opening, and all these Luke Skywalker and his fleet are bombing it, and they can't do anything to this Death Star, which is really the human personality, until Alec Guinness says, Luke, listen to the Force. And the Force leads the preacher, which is Luke, but in a funny way, to the tiny little interstice where it's the opening. And what I would pray, that I would get up in the church and I would pray that, Lord, open a door into just one person. What I would say is, Lord, help me to speak to the one person that I know is in trouble today. Now, it may be that there are 20 or 30 who are in trouble, but if in your mind you're speaking to the one individual whom you know is suffering deeply, that's the little opening. And if you can get in there, you in fact may get into the other guy. And what we found is that, let's say you preach for 3 months and nothing happens, or 8 months and nothing happens. One person walks into the church one day who's sort of disoriented, and all it takes is one person to hear it, because the message is brilliantly powerful, and that one person can change everything. Yes, and that happened in our ministry again. And in my case, I was very disheartened by this situation that a young law student that I knew at Radcliffe, and it was a wonderful person, great person, but things had not gone well. And I was also, I sort of thought, well, there must be something here. And I did pray. Someone said, an odd family friend, so why don't you pray, help me? And I did.
That's a good prayer.
But what happened immediately, I got a message from somebody that said, hey, I hear you're here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I know you. Why don't you come over for a cup of coffee? And then he invited me to an evangelical camp. I didn't know it was an evangelical camp, but it wasn't under false pretenses either. And somebody gave a sermon that was not that great, but it hit me so strongly that I was never the same. I mean, there are millions of loose ends. Sure. The Death Star has a ton of different floors. Right. But I think I agree. I feel that as someone who's in despair, and a lot of people right now are in despair, a suicidal despair, if you could just be there he may look like he's not interested, and he may have prejudice against what he thinks Christianity is, but he's about to kill himself. Yeah. And it'll be in the Daily Mail or the New York Post, age 36, died suddenly. And if you could have the guts to speak forthrightly about what we have, it would change everything.
Amen. Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, and you think about whoever that preacher was, whatever the power of that one invitation is. I mean, how many people's stories is one invitation begins to change something permanently? Yes. And it strikes me, the reason it's interesting to hear your stories, having read some of your work and seen the sort of movements of your heart, that checks out with that being the way you encountered the Lord, right? Like that you know it's true because it's true. It happened to you that way. Like this gospel has power.
let me add, there was a very you would say she was quite well known, a woman priest in the Diocese of New York. I invited her to come with me to a meeting of English evangelicals in 1977, and she was very much in the liberal theological world of American Protestantism. But she was a wonderful priest in New York, and I was just praying that she would hear this message, because it wasn't going to come from me. It just wasn't. We went together, and then she went to meetings, and she sat in one evening on a sermon that David Watson, who later brought John Wimber and had this incredible ministry in York. She sat in, and it was about 2 years before the John Wimber thing became electric, and she was converted outright. And she was going through a time of turmoil in her own understanding of herself in ministry. She was converted outright. And she came back, and because she was the person that she was, she had authority. She could talk about God had come into her heart in a way that I could not. And it was, there it was, right there.
See, I love this stuff.
And she still would say, to this day, she would say the same thing.
Wow, that's beautiful. Okay, so you have these formative experiences. You get, as far as you walking through the theological minds you described, it's a who's who of humans that people read and appreciate. And yet you're describing at the same time some cataclysmic internal problems with transference and just doing ministry. Right now there's any number of folks that, they might be thinking all the right things, doing all the right things the best they know how. But you're exactly right. That pastoral, the betrayals, the surprises of when you're interacting in people's lives. What would you say maybe to yourself or to someone that is going, I think I'm thinking the right I'm trying to live into this a certain way. You say you're coaching a bunch of different pastors and clergy. What are you finding most helpful as you're helping folks as they're managing all the different pains and pressures as they're doing ministry?
I want to avoid sounding, a little bit of a cliche, but this is a true cliche. Clergy needs someone to talk to at all times, basically. It doesn't necessarily mean every week, but probably every month. If you're actually in the trenches, the English call it supervision, which is a funny word. In other words, they would say, let's say you're very evangelical and very charismatic, but if you don't have some person with whom you can speak about your real feelings about what's going on, you will get caught unawares by a situation or an overall context, and you'll want to just leave forever, and you often will. Or you'll act out in some bad way, or you'll retreat inside yourself and become very, very cool in the sense of temperature. You'll lose your heart. So you have to be able to talk to someone who's good, who won't tell you what to do, but who really cares and loves you and understands. Yeah. And I would say I've always, by the grace of God, had someone like that with whom I could speak. And when I didn't, when I thought I could go it on myself, I would get to a point, and because your wife can't be your counselor, although, of course, in some ways, she's your total counselor. Yeah. But you have to have someone with whom you can speak, because what happens is people bury their dissatisfactions, whether they're in the world of the Vineyard USA or whether they're Episcopal ministers or whether they're gospel coalition, people, they bury it, and then suddenly they have a depressive episode or whatever it is. Yeah. So I would say what I'm saying is you have to bear witness to the truth of what you're actually experiencing. And what many people do, pastors, they suppress their dissatisfactions or their really hurts. That has got to be addressed. And if it doesn't, there's usually some kind of episode. Yeah. So that's what I would say.
That's good. No, that's real wisdom. And of course, I told you before we were recording that I put the cover of your book up when I spoke just a bit ago at our national conference. We talked about the thirds of life. Because as a movement, we're going through some of these movements, right? Like we have new folks coming in. We have folks that are in that second, third. They're working through all the different pains and pressures and challenges. And then we have folks, a huge chunk of our folks, the next 7 to 10 to 15, really 7 to 10 years, that are transitioning out of their roles, trying to figure out what does that mean. And we've been activist, hippie, charismatic, idealist, church planter, we're taking on the world types. And as those folks are aging, as well as those are coming into it, there's a lot of little transition moments in here. And I told you before we got on, reading your book really helped me to appreciate some of the struggles and the challenges of stepping into that last third of life. I had multiple people debating me, by the way, afterward, is how do you determine the thirds? Is that 30 years? Is that 25 years? I think it should be 35 years. I'm like, no, it should not be. Anyway, but they were going back and forth. But regardless, however you structure that, describe why you wrote that, because you've written prolifically all kinds of really helpful things about life with God and what is the nature of the gospel and how do we discover certain kinds of ways of living with God and with others. And this is a little different than that, but it fits some of what you've been doing for a long time. So describe a little bit about that, because it's been really helpful to me.
Well, let me give you three sort of trajectories here. The first is the second third of life is basically a kind of repetitive, circular, kind of unending turning of the same kinds of issues over and over again, which Charles Dickens says the second third of life should simply be called busy. Doesn't matter what you're doing, you're just busy. And you just end up doing 75% of what you're doing, even when you're doing it. It's like going to the Department of Motor Vehicles or filling out your taxes. It's ridiculous. Most of what we're listening, trying to get through a doctor's office in the computer, on your phone. But so the first thing that happens is that you find yourself doing this. And if you don't, you're in trouble. You sort of empirically, you're forced to detach from action consequence thinking. You simply are, because it doesn't work. Sometimes it's your body forces you to detach. Sometimes it's some mental issue. But the third involves a detachment from just about every idea you've had of what constitutes an achieved result. And by the way, that's absolutely 100% true. I say that with you, not because, it's not really true of me. Well, actually, it is, because at some point you're going to be in a hospital. I did a podcast recently having an echocardiogram, and I don't care what anyone says, whether you're black or white or rich or poor or male or female or whatever you are going to be totally naked, and you're going to be saying, what was that all about? Yeah. You can't help it if you're in some kind of physical distress or having a stent put in, and it could happen when you're 45 or 50. So the detachment is both empirically uniform and it's essential, because if you're not detached, then you suddenly lose your platform or the place where you were getting whatever your results were, and you're thrown into a complete spiral down of falling off a cliff. So I want to say that's the detachment. I know that sounds, I don't mean that. It just is, it's dust and ashes.
Yeah.
Ambition, the churches you'll literally wake up one day, you can't even remember. It's not because you got Alzheimer's, but things begin to recede. Now, some things don't recede, like certain love relationships, certain children that you have, certain hurts, certain disappointments, or even scars or stains that you carry. But that's the first trajectory, and the sooner the better. I was having dinner with a very, very wonderful guy who's 80, a retired attorney, very successful man, and he was all about this book that he'd read. And he said, the one thing I wish I'd read it 30 years ago.
Yeah. Because
like everyone else, he'd gotten so involved in the here and now. And then let's just say something happens, something outside him, something happens, and boop, And he wasn't ready. And so that's the first thing. And the second thing is that you need to bring the gospel to your unresolved pain. And I know that what does that mean? Well, you have to, because not everybody, let's just say you may have some unresolved pain from the past. It could be infantile. It could be from when you were 29.
Yeah.
It could be from something that happened when you were a teenager. Chances are that something has been suppressed, but it's still there. Usually it comes out when you're listening to a song. You listen to a song by the Doobie Brothers, and you say, "Oh, that song was when such and such happened," or when that horrible accident in which my father was killed. That's what I was listening to when I, or something like that. So, but you bring that to Christ. You bring your unresolved pain. And by the way, this is mandatory. It's mandatory descriptively. Not mandatory. No, I lie. Yeah, it's mandatory descriptively and empirically, not mandatorily judicially.
Right.
If you don't bring it, it will surface in the last 15 minutes of your life. I know that sounds dramatic, but I've been with countless people on their deathbed, and they suddenly say something. Where did that come from? And then they're dead in 15 seconds. What did he just say? Gone. So the second thing is you need to bring to a gracious God, a terrible thing you did once that may not have been that bad, but because you never mentioned it to anybody, it feels that bad, And so we have a message that is tailor-made for people who are older, who are still in the grip of a bad pregnancy or a terrible brutalization, whatever you want. And then the third thing, so the first was detachment or disattachment. I'd rather say detachment sounds too Eastern. Disattachment.
Yeah, right.
Second is you bring your story to to Christ on the cross, and he says, "Neither do I condemn thee." And we don't, by the way. I know that I'm saying to people that you won't. Oh, of course I do. No, you don't. You say you do, but you haven't told your wife something.
Yeah.
You never told your mother. You absolutely never told a friend about such and such. And that's, it's imperative empirically, not, empirically for you to have a happy third. And the last thing, and this is the good news, in the last third of life, you can't ask a pastor. People constantly say to me, or they'll ask you, "Oh, well, now, are you writing?" Or, "What are you doing?" And when you're in the last third of life, you can't answer the question. It's the wrong, that's the law, because you're not in the second third.
Yeah. What
happens is you stop, you wait, and God brings things for you to do. And this happens all the time. I mean, if I just don't initiate, I get 3 or 4 phone calls a day that involve a ministry response. It's not like I'm trying to write a book or I'm trying to have this effect on somebody, but something comes to you. I mean, it happens today. Just literally today, it's happened about 4 times. If you stop, there's a song, a Philadelphia soul song. What is it? Stop, look, listen to your heart. It's about 1974, and what happens is something comes to you and you get called to do this or that. And that's how God works, actually, all the time. But in the last third, not programmatically, but passively. And then sometimes too much comes.
Yeah.
Sometimes I get too much. Now, what do you think? I mean, where do you want to go from it?
I think that checks out. I think what's hard, I think that's true. I think I like the way you say it's empirically true. This isn't just, you probably should disattach. It's no. Listen, it's happening. Whether you participate with it or not in health is your choice, but it is happening. Your body literally will fail you. Your mind, the nature of how your professional life you will be disattached one way or another you should probably participate with that. I think, and of course, I've not had nearly the length of time of ministry you have, but the times I have been with people who are passing, the thing you're describing is always true. Like always. Like some old memory of real pain is there. Also, strangely, they'll maybe sing, people who I didn't know had any faith, for example, will sing a song about Jesus from their childhood.
Yes. Wonderful.
Like they can bear, they even as they're doing it go, I didn't even know I remembered this song, but it's, but I'm aware of it. Somehow God is working in them. So exactly what you're saying is things recede. There's some things that remain. And then the question is, what are you going to do about that? And that's why there's so many, there's all the little tropes of the bitter old man kind of thing, right? Like who all that they're aware of is what's gone and where there's been pain. So how do you do something about that? You said some things where you said, you bring those to God in a certain way. The gospel has something to say about that, the mercy of Jesus. But like practically, and what would you want to say to folks who are younger trying to serve and assist those that we love and we're caring for, like in a movement like ours? How do we help one another as these transitions are happening?
Well, that question has a kind of an answer, actually. And the answer is you listen. You listen to what a person has to say. And it may be initially circuitous. It may be, and also, by the way, alcohol is a huge factor with older people. It just is. The number of people who are quiet alcoholics, who are women and men who are older because the pain is too great, and then they become addicted in their 80s or whatever. But let's put that aside. You try to give people a chance. And people will talk. It may not be the first time you see them, but right. Because they're desperate to talk. So and this is where my wife Mary this is her great life's work, you might say, and she's been working with Frank Lake and Anne Long and others. Now she's sort of in her own right doing this. You listen. You really listen. You don't take turns talking, which is what everybody really does. You actually say, hey, Bill, tell me what you're thinking about. And you don't interpret. You don't put words in their mouth. You never bring your own experience into it. You do underline emotional words. If someone says, I'm a little bit, sometimes I think about my deceased wife so much, and I'm upset about my daughter's reaction to her death. And I'll say, upset? Yes, let me tell you. And what you find is that real listening, and that's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah.
Real listening, looking for the emotional underlinings of what a person, because a lot of people don't even know they're carrying this. They don't even know they're carrying something, but they are. And it's animating a tremendous amount of negativity. And if they can just have the chance to talk to a listening ear, it may just be 5 minutes will change their whole life. Well, Paul, I've never told anybody about this, or I've never shared this, but when I was 25, da-da-da-da-da-da-da.
Yeah.
And I just, what do you think? And just inevitably, there's a calm that creates the God is going to work through that. So listening is the one word I might vouchsafe.
Hey everyone, we're Daniel Nicole Hernandez, pastor and worship leader in Columbus, Ohio.
Hola a todos, somos Daniel y Nicole Hernández, pastor y líder de adoración en Columbus, Ohio.
From September 15th to October 15th is Hispanic Heritage Month, and to celebrate, we want to share an exciting new project of Vineyard Worship. But before, we want to let you know that we have a National Association gathering coming up April 15th to the 18th called Better Together. Registration is opening soon, so be on the lookout and save the date. Recently, we have been working with Vineyard Worship to organize and increase resources for Spanish-speaking and bilingual churches.
Recientemente, hemos estado trabajando con Vineyard Worship para incrementar recursos para iglesias de habla hispana y bilingüe.
We have a new Spanish translation team with representatives from all over the U.S. and Latin America, and we are working to translate songs in a way that will work for the majority of our Spanish-speaking churches.
Hemos formado un nuevo equipo de traducción al español con representantes de todos los Estados Unidos y Latinoamérica, y estamos trabajando para traducir canciones en una manera que funcione para la mayoría de nuestras iglesias de habla hispana.
There are now Spanish translations of many of our Vineyard songs, along with bilingual songs that have intentionally been written in both Spanish and English. You can find all our Spanish music under the name Adoración Viña, Vineyard in Español, on Spotify, Apple, Pandora, and more. You can find all these resources and more at vineyardworship.com/adoración and vineyardsongs.com. Links are in the show notes.
Puedes encontrar todos estos recursos y más en vineyardworship.com/adoración o vineyardsongs.com. Los enlaces están en las notas del episodio.
What you're also advocating for is what I hear you advocating for is as you're getting older, noticing these things that come toward you or sort of emerge, like noticing what you ruminate on and starting to recognize that it's harder and harder to push those things away. They're present in a way that maybe you were at earlier stages able to sort of kick out of the way with some busyness.
That's exactly right.
You're not able to now. I have a very good friend that does a whole lot of internal work kinds of things. He's a family systems guy and a spiritual formation guy. Really, and he's a dear friend. And so he has this process he does with people to notice places where there's trauma or unresolved things in your life. And it's like a 6-month thing. And I've been doing some work with him and we're friends. And I said, gosh, I don't know if I have time to do 6 months of stuff. Like, I'm busy. I got a lot I'm doing. And he's like, Jay, you're a pretty stable dude. You do really hard work. Maybe you are fine. I don't know. And I was like, yeah, but you should convince me. Why should I do this? He goes, I don't have to convince you. Do whatever you want. You're a good guy. The Lord will lead you. And I'm like, no, come on. Convince me. He said, okay, well, if I was going to convince you, here's what I'd say. I'd say right now, you don't realize it, but you have a lot of energy. You might not think you do, but you do. And what you don't know is how much of that energy are you using subconsciously or outside of your awareness to manage painful stuff in your life. So let's say you have
perfect. Brilliant.
Yeah, he says you have 10 widgets of energy. You might be using 4 widgets managing stuff. You just don't know you are. He says usually somewhere around 50, and then again at 65 or 70. 50 is when it starts, that the widgets start going down of your energy. So if you have 10 and you're using 4, well, then you have 9. Now you have 8. Now you have 7. Now you have 6. and what you don't realize is you can't manage it. He says, so listen, if you want to wait till you're 50 to do some work with me, we can wait. Or if you want to wait till the bottom comes out, something breaks, I love you. We'll work on it.
Wonderful.
But you could start taking a look under the hood now.
I like that very much, Jay.
And it was such a helpful thought because I went, I would like to do some of this work now. And I'm sure there'll be more to do some other time, because what I find interesting about what you're saying is it's probably not true. It might be true, but it's probably not true that the kinds of things people are suppressing, they're doing actively. It's not like they wake up every day and say, I'm not going to think about this. But because they're going through a different transition in their life, now it's present in a way that it wasn't. And then they have a choice to make. Am I going to figure out how to shove this away, or can I find a listening ear like you're describing? Can I find a way to get to God? So, but yeah, everything you're saying resonates with me deeply. I agree.
I like the way your friend, colleague puts it, that the strength of the ability, the physical strength to suppress it, which becomes habitual, by the way,
Yes.
it becomes habituated, is lessening at a certain point. Call it the last third. I've not put it this way. You've opened the door for me. But so the material, and there is material in, let's say maybe 9 out of 10. I don't want to say it's 100%. Say 9 out of 10 people have pain of some kind. And I don't want to exaggerate, but it's there. The ability to suppress it. I mean, what I always tell people, I said, what are the songs? Because with guys, it's almost always rock music of some sort. What is the song? Is it Dennis Yost and the Classic Four and Traces from the summer of 1969? Or is it Soulful Strut, or is it a Motown song in my generation, or is it a song? Is it Journey? Is some song Separate Ways by Journey, or is it? But it's usually the song that keeps recurring is a clue, or sometimes a movie. That keeps coming back that you like to watch, but the reason you really like it is because it brings back some experience that needs to be, the expression abreaction. Abreaction is a Freudian psychoanalytic expression, a very good one, that we have these emotions that are buried, but when they come out in the form of tears or real serious feeling, they're cured. In other words, when they come out, and I don't want to sound, again, manipulative, but if I have something that's buried that comes out and I'm really overcome with the feeling, and I tell you, and you don't try to interfere, you just listen, I will feel better.
Yeah.
I will get more energy, because the suppressive energy does not have to be so strong.
Yeah.
And again, without getting too psychoanalytic, as Christians, we can do this because we know that Jesus forgave the thief on the cross. Yeah. That is to say, he said 70 times 7. We are dealing with a God who is completely able to handle whatever pain that is suppressed. And I can't. I love what he has expressed. What happens to many men? They're caught unawares by surges of feeling that have hitherto been habitually suppressed.
Yeah, that's true.
Jay.
Yeah, well, he still really helps me. I need help. I think everybody needs help. And so help me think about this then. We're describing that third. The other dynamic that I find complicated, that I think you could help me think through, or us think through, is, so when you're in your third, you're also a lot smarter about lots of things. And so you watch people in that second third or that first third doing dumb things. I think back on pastors that put me in charge of things. I'm 18. They're like, okay, you can lead this thing. And at the time, that pastor was in his early 40s, which seemed like ancient, of course, when he's asking me to do it. And now, when I get into my 40s, I'm looking at 18-year-olds going, there's no way I would want to trust them with the kind of stuff he trusted me with. And so there's always that desire to sort of coach, meddle, say, I wouldn't do it that way. How does that, and yet there's deep wisdom there. Hey, let me help you, younger version of myself, think about this area of ministry, or this thing I see you doing in your marriage, or I noticed something, it's sort of the grandparent role, right? I'm noticing a way you're raising your kids here. But there's that meddling versus helping reality. How have you found wisdom in raising kids, mentoring leaders, and in finding your place in this last third? How does that work?
Well, it's very, first, what happens is people think that they can offer wisdom interrogatively or interventionally, and you can't. It's human nature is such that anything I say to a younger pastor, well, have you thought about, I'm not quite sure. I think that was the right thing to say during the announcements last Sunday. Or maybe, the way you described such and such, that didn't come off doing what you wanted. That never works. I've tried that. But what you do is everything has to be shifted back to a grace model and an empirical model. Let me explain. Yeah. If I give a person advice, it'll never work, because they'll in fact do the opposite, and they won't talk to me again. The phone calls will stop. What has to happen is I have the person I'm trying to reach, I have to treat as a subject, not an object. In other words, he's a subject who has pain or distress or problems. He's not an object for me to straighten out, because it'll never work that way. So it may be that you see a young pastor who's lovely, a really great guy with a wonderful, enterprising wife and all the optimism and faith and love in the world, but they're going in the wrong direction, and there's nothing I can do. However, when I get a phone call from that particular person 4 years into it, oh, hey, Paul, I don't want to bother you, but, I guess I'd like to, I got something I'd like to talk to you about. Within 3 minutes of that conversation, it'll come out. And my job there, think about who's mentored you. That's what I tell people. Think of who mentored you. I can look back upon the 25 people that should have mentored me. And about 4 of them I love. 4 of them I miss. I love. I cry when I think, because they're dead. They're mostly dead. I think of them and they were the best in the world. But none of them told me what to do. They all were people who inspired my tentative, groping attempts to be needy, and didn't condemn me, and just were good fathers. They were good fathers, and it was striking. So that's what I want to be like. I don't want to be. I want to see these guys as the way I was. I was a subject. I needed what they. So just think back. I would tell an older person of how the people that helped you, and none of them said you were coaches. Not a single one, although they may have used the word, was a coach. I have about 5 coaches. I don't even know their names from the past 50 years. And I've got an old beloved rector who's been dead for 40 years, who was a man of God, who just looked at me like Jesus. When he looked at me, I thought Jesus was looking at me. One bishop, his name was Edward Salmon. Edward Salmon is now dead, but he was a remarkable Episcopal bishop on the traditional side, but he was unbelievable. And he would just say, as a bishop, he'd come and he was look the part, all this white hair. And he'd say, Paul, now what do you really need right now? And I'd say, I'd sort of like to go to Germany and get a degree on justification by faith. And what did he say? Did he say, well, when I was your age, I had to deal with that, or let me tell you how, you know what he said? He said, well, let's see if we can do that. That's all he said. He said, let's see if we can pull that off. And immediately I had a friend. So I would just say that if you want to mentor a young person, just show up and wait. And it may unfortunately be the wrong young person who calls you. The person you want to reach isn't the one. When Jesus, look at the people that came to him.
Yeah.
I was in Chevy Chase, Maryland, Jay, in a world that I knew very well, a world of what some people call the swamp, other people call it the establishment, whatever you want to call it. And I knew this world, and I was preaching. And I thought my job in my 50s, 60s was to convert highly placed, quote, accomplished Washington types. And it didn't happen. The people that I thought would, Bob Mueller was there in the congregation, and this person and that person. They were not the ones. The people who got converted were the divorced father of 3 and the single mom who was having a breakdown and the sort of semi-homeless guy. But they were the ones. Right. And I returned to Barron and I said, I thought I came here for a different demographic. Right. And obviously not.
Yeah.
Obviously not.
That's really powerful. And I guess it requires restraint. It requires a certain kind of humility, because it is possible you can, exactly what you said, you can see what's wrong, but it's believing that's not going to work. I'm not going to actually help if I show up and say, here's what you need to do, or here's the thing I noticed, it doesn't quite do what it's supposed to do. That's
because you're right, by the way. You're right.
Yeah, exactly.
You're correct.
That's the worst part, is that you're right. Yeah, because that makes it harder. What would you say on the other side when you think on what it looks like to honor rightly, care for? We already said listening, but like what else does somebody in that second third of their life with parents, grandparents, mentors, leaders that they're watching in those transitions? Is there more to say? Because we already said listening. What else is there to say about how do you rightly serve and care for people in these moments?
Well, the other thing that I have done, and I've taught a lot of clergy who are very young, I've tried to underline some of the problems that are endemic to intrinsic to active parish ministry, whether it's the Vineyard or whether it's, because it's basically Catholic priests basically do the same thing that I did and that you do. It just looks a little different.
Totally. I agree.
It has different formats, but they're basically doing the same. Orthodox priests wear all these gowns that I find, but basically it's still the same thing.
Totally.
And what I would do is I would open their eyes to the reality of transference, because that is the epistemologically, hermeneutically, that is the key fact in ministry that can be used occasionally. Catholic cardinals can occasionally, the Pope can use the transference to do good. But with most of us, the transference gets twisted. And if clergy, I would always talk about that and say, they said, that explains why, so-and-so got so upset when I moved a candle on the altar. Right. And I thought to myself, why would she get so upset at a nothing and think that I had been the worst person? It has nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
I would give certain transference is something you can never talk enough about. Yeah. Secondly, I would help with preaching. I would always teach a person how to preach from their own experience, but not narcissistically. The other day I was talking to my wife and I said, but deeply identified from your own experience, but without needing some kind of response, which is counter-transference. So I would always unmask those things. And young preachers got that. They got that. So I would help with preaching. I would underline transference. And I would also try to help them to disattach from some of the things like ambition. Of course, you can't do that. And I have a very low, my churchmanship is very low. Right. I mean, I'm an Episcopalian, and I still am. But in terms of the institution, I don't have much confidence in it. One of the things, one of our children is a very active, one of our sons is a very active, he's your age, he's a very, very active Episcopal minister, and right in the heart of everyday parish ministry and doing wonderfully, but he seems to be less attached to the institution than his father. I would take these bishops very seriously and rather be like Monty Python. Monty Python is always joking about authority.
Yep.
I'm Bishop so. And as a result, if you can, and the British were wonderful about this because they were all Monty Pythons. I went to a service up in was it Burnley? It was an industrial town way up in the north of ordination, and this very, very beautifully dressed cathedral dean with all of these robes, and he looked right out of a Anthony Trollope novel. And I said, "Hi, I'm Paul Zahl. I'm from America." "Oh," he said, "what are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I'm at St. John's College." He said, "Oh." Then he sort of said, "Well, brother, I went there too." And all of a sudden, all the baloney, and he looked at me and he said, "And can you believe the way I look today?" Yes. And I thought, I love this guy.
Yeah.
Because he's detached in a way that I'm sure the Vineyard has its own forms of institutional
Yes.
approval.
Right.
So I was being in England and watching Monty. I would tell people, watch Monty Python. And by the way, develop your sense of humor, and not sardonic, not sarcastic.
Yes.
But there's nothing wrong with having people who don't have a sense of humor. A lot of these reform guys, I mean, they're very good, and I believe the same things they believe, but you have to work hard to get them to laugh in the middle of a 45-minute exposition.
Yes.
And if they could only, like Tim Keller was great. Now, Tim I knew. Tim could make you, but he was very exceptional.
Yes, he was in every way, really. Yeah.
And he was dealing with the human heart.
Yeah.
Not just, but humor, transference, preaching, and of course, movies and rock and roll. What I always tell people, one of our sons is also in the ministry, another one of our sons, and he's a DJ. He's a literal DJ. He's a very highly sought after late night DJ all over the place. And that's, you have to find a way to stay sane.
Yes.
You have to have some way that's not arbitrary, but real, something you really like to do. And it can be anything.
Yeah. Those are good. Okay. So I've taken a lot of your time, but so let's try to land the plane somehow. Like, these are really helpful thoughts. You know a bit of the Vineyard. You've been around folks in the Vineyard. Of course, you refer to John Wimber. So you have a lot of leaders, pastors from the Vineyard listening, because we're in transition moments. I would be of the generation that knew not John Wimber, kind of a major shift in what we're doing. And I love my family. I love everything that's been given to me. And I'm honored to lead. But what would you want to say to us? Like, you've been in a lot of denominational spaces, a lot of different kinds of people in ministry. What would you want to say that would say something to the Vineyard?
Well, I do have something I'd like to say, if I can put it that way, because we're talking really about a form of Christianity that is, in certain ways, could be described as Pentecostal. Am I not right? Not strictly speaking, but charismatic.
Yeah.
I knew the church where John Wimber lived and died. I mean, he was there all the time. I would say first, stick with your view of a supernatural God. Don't reduce, in other words, allow yourself to enjoy your confidence, which has been part of your life. Yeah. You wouldn't be in the ministry if you hadn't had a verticality to your faith. I would say stick with it. And I would also stick with the faith dimension. We used to say name it, claim it, or that's not your problem, but there's something in the charismatic tradition about faith, real, just one step of faith to which God responds. Yeah. See the movie Little Boy that was made about 15 years ago. You've probably seen it. It's about a little boy in World War II who's given faith to pray for something with no evidence whatsoever. It's a religious movie, but it's a major movie, Little Boy. And God answers his prayer in such an extraordinary way that it's one of the most unpopular movies in the secular world. The Village Voice devoted an entire page to hating it. See that movie. So stick with the faith dimension, the verticality, and the supernatural God. Yeah. The only thing that I would also say is keep your feet on the ground when it comes to original sin. Because original sin, as the articles of the 39 articles of the Church of England from 1550s, remember that sin inherith, yea, even in the believer. Sin inherith, even in the believer. Yeah. Now, you know this, and we all know it, but always remember that keep in touch. Don't promise more than inherent original sin will tend to cramp or try to destroy. Yeah. Be a realist in the right way. Yeah. So a deeply Pauline anthropology, coupled with the Jesus Christ faith relationship, coupled with Moses on the mountain, will give a vineyard pastor a depth and a power that most of my colleagues have never been able to be in touch with. So I envy the vineyard pastors. who are able to draw on the faith tradition and God and the supernatural, but keep it rooted in Romans chapter 7.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, does that ring bells at all?
It rings all the bells. Yeah, I'm in. I mean, I don't think, you said us, and I would include me. I wouldn't know how to do anything that resembles ministry if I'd not had a series of bona fide encounters with the living God. I wouldn't even, and I think that would be true almost across the board in the Vineyard. I would say across the board. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone that wouldn't describe something of that nature. And yeah, the best of us is when we try for things that we have no business trying for, except for that we trust in God. I mean, like from church planting to whatever else. And I think the best of us has been when we are wildly authentic and honest about how sin and brokenness and failure is in the midst of every person's heart. That's the best. That's the best of who we are. We're reaching for everything we can, trusting God for miracles, and honestly assessing reality in light of what doesn't work in us, let alone in our systems and our churches and other kinds of things. So, yeah, I resonate deeply with what you're saying.
Can I just say, I wish I could have hired you when I was the dean of the seminary. No, because what you said it better than I. You've and every one of your pastors says what is absolutely essential in the ministry. You've had an experience of God at a time of need that altered your entire course of experience. Yeah. And you're coming from that place, and never forget that.
Yeah, no, it's the resting place, isn't it? Yeah,
it's a resting. So I'm just very much with you there, Jay.
Oh, I'm so encouraged by you, and I'm encouraged by your boys and watching so much of the ministry that flows from your family. I mean, that would be. I'd love another hour with you to say, how do you raise a family in this stuff? I mean, like that. Question. It's not easy to do, and that they people find their own way, but somehow they're trying to follow Jesus and live lives demonstrating the kingdom. In and of itself is about the best win you can hope for as a parent, I think. But yes. But I'm so grateful for your work. We're going to link in the show notes the book you wrote and some other books you've written. I would recommend the audiobook for what it's worth, because I got to hear your voice. The amount of references, rock and roll things, movies, scenes from this or that. I love the way your mind works. I was listening to it. I can't remember where we were. I was somewhere with my wife. We might have been on vacation. And I just kept laughing. I'd giggle a little bit. We're sitting somewhere, and she'd go, "Why are you laughing?" I go, the way his mind works is so similar to the way my mind works. I can see the scenes. I can hear the songs when he's saying them. I just enjoyed it. And there's a joy in the way that you think and you live, and the way you illustrate things. Monty Python is the funniest stuff that exists in the world to me. To this day. I got to know Brits later, but I would watch Monty Python as a kid. I like it so much that so many of my friends that are Brits are like, I think you're more British than me. There's something about this that you just find hysterical. And I do. It's the turn of phrase. It's the sort of absurdity that they use. I studied philosophy as well. And so much of the way they use their mind, and it's just, I don't know why. It's like I'm inconsolable. I laugh so hard, even stuff I've already seen. I know the scene that's coming, and I start laughing just anticipating it. But that makes me kind of weird. But anyway, so I just love the way your mind works. I'm so grateful that you continue to write, that you're serving clergy. Thank you so much for what you've done and what you are doing.
Very much. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a beneficiary, and I'm excited that our movement gets to be introduced to some of your work.
Thank you so much.
The The We Are Vineyard podcast is a production from the team at Vineyard USA. If you've been enjoying the podcast, here's a few ways you can help us. Leave us a review on the podcast platform of your choice. This helps more people find us. Connect with us online for additional resources. Our website is vineyardusa.org, and we're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at VineyardUSA. Thanks for listening. See you next week.